Hey there, Colts fans. This is Nathan Brown, your Colts insider for the Indianapolis Star, here with Joel A. Erickson for another edition, and now a fully off-season edition of the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. Here to break down, dive into a little bit on what Chris Ballard said a couple weeks ago in his press conference. I know it's been a little bit. We both had a little bit of time to get away, refresh, recharge a little bit, and still feels fairly early in what will be and already has been an eventful Colts offseason here. We know that head coach Shane Steichen, GM Chris Ballard are coming back. We've heard from both of them along with Irsay-Gordon, the team's principal owner, in the week immediately following the end of the regular season. We've seen some of what has gone on in the playoffs, what some of those teams that are still alive in the playoffs now, those four teams heading into conference championship weekend are like, and maybe have a better sense of some of the targets that the Colts need to hit at as we approach free agency and the draft here over the next couple months. Of course, to dive into all of that, Joel, I know we're looking back here a couple weeks now since we heard from Chris Ballard, but what would you say your biggest takeaway was from getting to hear from him, of course, a couple days after we learned that he would again be coming back for what will be his 10th season at the helm in Indianapolis?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to me is just, and I'm gonna start out by saying that a lot of this podcast is gonna look forward. I know a lot of Colts fans still feel like, why is he still here? You could be saying that really since 2022, and I wouldn't have a great answer for you. But like we've kind of dealt with that in terms of Carly's podcast, and also like Carly's for press conference, and honestly, the other thing is like we're going to look forward with this stuff because it doesn't seem like that's going to change really. Like this is going to be Ballard going forward. So I think the thing that stuck out to me most is just in the moment, and we knew this. I think most people knew this, but in the moment, or I should say, writers knew this. I think the public was more surprised than I was expecting with the idea that like in the Colts' mind, the quarterback for 2026 is Daniel Jones. Mm-hmm. Shane Steichen had already hinted that way. Jones had hinted he'd like to be back. You could not come away from Ballard's press conference without thinking that they are all in on Daniel Jones for 2026, which I think we can get to a few of the potential pitfalls with that. But that was the biggest thing to take away is like, yes, he's coming off an Achilles tear. No, they're not really looking anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, you heard it from everywhere over that week immediately following the end of the season. We heard it from Shane Steichen, again, not definitively because Shane only has so much decision-making power in that, but you could definitely tell that Shane wanted to have Daniel back. And when he was asked questions about him in those weeks, immediately following his injury and his surgery, he only talked about how much Daniel was around the building, which, I don't, as someone who's, still in my first season on the beat, I guess you probably still would do that, even if you were a free agent. But he was just so very much involved and very present around this team, a team that not long after he suffered that injury had pretty long, if not no, playoff odds whatsoever. And he was still ever present. He certainly was not someone that was kind of going off and doing his own thing or seeking out his own doctors or his own rehab specialists as he tried to work his way back from this. It certainly seems like this is a place where he found a good home and a home that he would like to keep. No doubt Shane would love to have him back. They created a really strong bond this year together. And Chris Ballard and Carly Irsay-Gordon both believe, Chris told us stepping off the plane, coming home from Berlin, he felt like he had one of the four best teams in the NFL at the season's halfway point, entering thereby. They just acquired Sauce Gardner. They were 8-2. They were readily aware that the 7 games to end the season were not going to be a cakewalk. They all appeared to be either definite or potential playoff teams, but they felt like they had a team underneath them to go and fight and still, battle for the AFC South at minimum, end up with a playoff spot and enter the postseason with a shot to make some more noise than they have in the last decade. And as we have talked about here numerous times, the bottom just kind of fell out, and just about everything internally and externally that could go wrong did go wrong, from injuries, from late games that went the wrong way. I think I wrote a lengthy story a week or so ago. I think they had the lead with 30 seconds left to go in regulations 3 times and lost all of those games. All of the teams that they were battling for playoff positioning nearly won out the rest of the season between the Jaguars, the Texans, and the Chargers. It left interesting, as bad as things got, it almost went so wrong that the Colts just felt like they still could be in that same position in 9 or 10 months from now if they brought Daniel Jones and some of their other core pieces back and just didn't get the same type of injury luck. And so that's ultimately why it feels like Daniel Jones can be back. The timing of his injury, again, I know we felt at the time that it was maybe a little dicey for him to be able to be back for the start of the season, but certainly everyone around the organization and Daniel himself have been talking as if being back for the start of training camp is a very realistic expectation. And so it certainly seems like, as long as they can find common ground on a contract, that he will be back there and he will be the Colts quarterback week 1 of the 2026 season.
Yeah. The obvious question mark here, and everyone's pointed this out. The reason that people weren't necessarily certain that Jones would be the quarterback is he tore his Achilles tendon in December. And I think we've gone over this on the pod, but it's worth saying again. Like, we did ask why they felt so confident in his Achilles recovery. And I did bring up the point that I've made here before, that this team has bet heavily on Achilles tendon recoveries before, with not a lot of success really in the first year. Eric Fisher was a good run blocker but couldn't pass block. Marlon Mack never really got it back. Julian Blackmon, those 2 years, the year of him tearing his Achilles, and then the year after that is probably his worst full season in an Indianapolis uniform. He was very, he played nickel, he played free, he played strong. They didn't know what to do with him. And then the next year after that, he had a very solid season. Trying to think of who I'm missing here. Dayo Odengbo, coming off of his, missed half a year. And then when he came back, really wasn't the player that he would end up being for the Colts. So there's been a lot of these that they've bet. Samson Ebukam is another one. Samson Ebukam this year was a pass rusher who just really didn't have a whole lot of juice coming back off of an Achilles tear. So that's 5 guys I mentioned. I'm probably missing 1 or 2. I brought up a couple of those guys to him. He cited a couple of things. He said, he's a quarterback. He's not one of these other positions. They cited how he's going to attack his rehab, which this might be talking out of turn a little bit, but I don't know when a team says that, or when the Colts say that specifically. I don't know how you take it, but there's a part of my head, there's something in my head that's kind of saying, like, how much does that matter?
I mean,
I don't know.
I feel like for you to have reached the NFL, you are not just a spectacular talent. You also have to be, you have to care a lot about your job, and you have to be very particular about taking care of your body. And so hearing someone say, he's going to really attack his recovery, it would be surprising to find someone in a different position or a different player who which is kind of lackadaisical about their Achilles recovery, because if you don't come back from this strong, your career in the NFL is going to be over, because there's going to be someone there to take your spot, no matter who you are, whether you're a quarterback or whether you're a safety or a running back or a defensive lineman. So I know Daniel Jones has been, he's heralded for his attention to detail and his dedication to the craft and his hard work away from the facility. And so I don't know that I'm certainly not doubting that he is going to do every single thing possible in his power to do this, but I don't know that we definitely know that he's going to approach this any differently than those 5 guys that you mentioned. And again, as you stated, there are very mixed results. Even more recently from a quarterback standpoint. I know there's not as many examples, but Kirk Cousins and Aaron Rodgers are both quarterbacks that come to mind that have done this somewhat recently. Rodgers' procedure that he used to repair his was a little bit different than Daniel's. And he also did his on the second play of the entire season, and was maybe prepared to come back if the Jets had remotely been in postseason contention, and they weren't. Those guys are much older than Daniel Jones. I don't know that you can necessarily say that those guys were the same quarterbacks that they were before those injuries happened. I think they were, but it's also hard to know how much of that is the injury and how much of that is just having a large chunk of time away from the sport, getting back from any sort of, major leg trauma, and being 1 year older when you're north of 35, which Daniel, of course, is not.
Yeah, I just have some. I mean, I do think that how a guy rehabs probably has something to do with most injuries. I don't know that you can count on. I don't know that you can count on it for this, because there's also an element of, no matter how hard you work at something, there's only so much you can do. Mm-hmm. I think in football sometimes the way it gets talked about. I was just watching. I know I'm late to this, but I was just watching the Jerry Jones Netflix thing last night, and this is what made me think of it. It's just there was so much talk on there about will to win and stuff like that, and I was like, is it that you wanted to win more than other teams, or is it because you had literally one of the most talented rosters?
Yeah,
probably the most talented roster of any team we've seen since then.
Quite possibly.
Because they're saying this right in the middle of Charles Haley also saying, them also saying that Charles Haley is a crazy person who tried to beat up his coach and stuff like that in San Francisco. I don't know. Want to obviously matters in sports. It's really hard to measure, but there's also an element of just you can only do what your body will allow you to do. 100%. And so that's the question with Jones for me is, I don't have any doubt that he's going to rehab really hard and work really hard, but my understanding from talking to guys who've torn their Achilles tendon is that usually the second year after they're back is when they're fully back to themselves. I don't think that's necessarily because the guys I talked to were lackadaisical with their rehab. I think that's just the nature of the injury. Your body has to respond to what is a very significant injury. I don't know. I think sometimes in football there's sort of a, well, if you just want it bad enough, but there's limitations. There's just limitations to that. Your body is a limitation to that. You can come into a training camp as an undrafted free agent and desperately want to be in the NFL, and if you're not fast enough or strong enough or good enough, it doesn't matter how much you want it. And I think the same thing kind of applies to injuries as well. So I am skeptical of the idea that Jones is going to be right back to himself right when he starts. I think that maybe the argument that maybe carries a little bit more weight, although Cousins and Rodgers would be a vote in the other direction if you ask me, that maybe the idea that he's playing quarterback helps because it's not as explosive a position. You don't need the explosiveness really there as much as you do anywhere else. But also the flip side of that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, is that he was a diminished player a little bit, and the offense was diminished when he wasn't able to move with the fibula. So, yeah, I have concerns about the injury. I think that's the ultimate way to come down on this is the Colts seem very, very confident in his Achilles recovery. And maybe Achilles surgeries have gotten better the way maybe we're in the early stages of Achilles, because there was a Steelers player who had a very quick one this year. So maybe we're in the early stages of the Achilles kind of making advances sort of the way the ACL did a while ago. But yeah, I have concerns with that Achilles injury going forward. And I think most fans do, and what I'm telling you is I agree. I get it.
I think part of the uniqueness of this too is that we know, even though Carly didn't say it explicitly, that this is a team that, although fans will say, probably rightly so, that it should have been this way for quite some time. This is a team that needs to take concrete steps forward, needs to make the postseason, needs to execute, find ways to win games, or this regime is likely going to be completely changed this offseason. They don't really have time to have this gap year of Daniel Jones getting back to 100%, and maybe having another middling year before then saying, okay, now this is going to be the year that we are, we're coming at this with guns blazing, and we've got, a roster that's capable of making a big run. I mean, there are a lot of guys on this roster, leaders, veterans, that if they're not up for contract extensions this current offseason that we're heading into now, are going to be up after the next season. So this Colts team needs to know what direction it needs to head, and so much of that, as we have seen with the 4 teams that are still alive in the playoffs, who are all a little bit different, but I think you can say without a doubt are dependable, reliable quarterbacks in late game situation, dynamic when they need to be, not necessarily the best that this league has to offer, because you have to have the other pieces around them, but you have to have a quarterback capable of at times helping you win games and also just not losing you games when you're in tight situations. And the Daniel Jones that we saw, again, I know it wasn't directly related to his torn Achilles, but a diminished version of Daniel Jones in those 2 games that we saw in Kansas City and against the Houston Texans, games that the Colts ultimately lost. Tight games, 1-possession games that started that 7-game slide to end the season, was not a level of quarterback that I think would have taken you to an 8-2 record to start the year. And so if you are the Colts, you are betting on Daniel Jones being as close to 100% as possible, which includes being a threat at times to scramble and make plays with his legs, whether that be running the ball or scrambling until he can find an open receiver, which is not something that we saw in those 2 games before he then did go and tear his Achilles. I don't know that the concern is as much about, finding guys, having the arm, having the connection with the receivers that he's obviously going to have still, but it's just both the tiny things and timing, dynamicism, and the ability to make plays with his legs, which is so much of what he does and what he had success with that I think are looming questions. And when you are a Colts team that cannot afford to again be 8-9 or 9-8 and missing the playoffs, that's a big bet that you're making. Although I say that, and I also don't know, if you know that you need to make the playoffs next year, I don't know that there's another option out there that I feel really great that's reasonable at the same time.
Well, that's the underlying thing is who are you going to get that's better, or that's a better fit. And realistically, I don't know that there's that player out there, because Tua Tagovailoa's injury issues, concussion issues, to me are actually more significant than what Jones has. And I think that, the familiarity of Jones kind of outweighs that when you consider those injuries. You could trade for Kyler Murray. From what we know of what Kyler Murray was in Arizona, I think he's a poor fit for Shane Steichen, just in terms of the way those two fit together. This is not a good quarterback draft. I mean, it's great. Nathan is wearing his Indiana stuff. It's great if you're the Raiders and you get Fernando Mendoza, but beyond that, it's not great.
No.
Like I was watching the national championship game and I saw them flash the thing that Carson Beck is Kuiper's 5th quarterback. Yuck. That's all I'm going to say to that. So there's not really a draft. There's not really like an option in the draft necessarily. The other quarterbacks were potentially. It's a bad year to need a quarterback, and so I think that's ultimately part of this is it's not just the highs of what they had in the first 10 games that they're hoping for. It's also where else do they feel like they can go, that's not a great spot to be in, but that's where the Colts are. I think one of the other things that stands out to me from this whole thing, and something I've been chewing on without necessarily a concrete answer. We might have talked about this on our last podcast. It's been a while since then. Just so you guys know, Nathan covered a IndyCar season and then essentially covered an NFL season right after that. So the poor man has not had a lot of time off. That's why we had a little break here. But the idea that Carly Irsay-Gordon really valued 2025 over the entire tenure, and why she valued the 2025 over the entire tenure really has stuck with me. I don't know that she really gave us an answer to that, but Chris Ballard said some stuff that indicated to me that the way he operated in free agency and the trade deadline, being more aggressive, going for bigger name players, being more willing to fork over a big dollars in free agency, is going to continue. And those are also the changes that she cited as why he's still here. Mm-hmm. That is interesting to me. I don't know that I have a great complete answer for why that's the case, but it does feel like what she wants to see, what Carly Irsay-Gordon wants to see as owner, is a more aggressive general manager that's willing to go out and get some of these players. Her father was not like that. Just frankly, when we brought up free agency in the past, he would frequently reference the Andre Johnson, Trent Cole bust after a bust of spending. He was not like that. She seems to be. The why is what's interesting to me. Like why did he? Is it the ownership changed? The free agency happened last year before Irsay died. Like, is that why he got another year? Because she felt like she wants to see another year of him of Ballard operating the way she wants to see a team operate in terms of talent acquisition.
It's really interesting timing, as you mentioned there. Like, he had been here for 8 seasons. You would think, that who someone is after 8 years in that role with one team, if you're just all of a sudden deciding that the way you operate isn't working, and you need to, switch gears, I think my gut would tell me, why did it take you 8 years to get to that conclusion? But obviously, he was brought back and then made these, Jim Irsay, who was certainly still with us at the end of the 2024 season, made the choice to bring both Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard back. And as you mentioned there, it was then when they took some more swings in free agency. They signed Charvarius Ward. They signed Cameron Bynum. They signed Daniel Jones. Daniel certainly wasn't very expensive from a quarterback standpoint and wasn't guaranteed to be the starter coming in. But before Jim Irsay ultimately did pass away, you saw a little bit of a switch there. And so I don't know where those conversations came from, if they, if that was solely Chris feeling like he needed to switch gears, or if there were conversations elsewhere that felt like they kind of pushed him in that direction. But it was certainly notable that, it wasn't like he just made this Sauce Gardner trade at the trade deadline a couple months ago, kind of out of nowhere. You could point to things in the previous offseason to hint at the idea that he was taking some bigger swings. I know when we asked him about that in the press conference, he said, we did go and, we signed DeForest Buckner. There were some other instances that he mentioned. It's not like they hadn't traded anyone, but there were not a ton of them. Certainly when you look at some other teams in the league, I know like a team like the Rams, for example, have had 1 first-round pick or less 7 seasons. There are a lot of teams in the NFL that make a lot more trades than the Colts had. And they're starting to get into that mix. Really interested to see what that could look like for this offseason. We know some of the targets that they have to re-sign from their own roster between Daniel Jones and Alec Pierce, and the looming question they have at on the offensive line between Braden Smith and Jalen Travis. Those are kind of the big ideas, but certainly when you look at that defense, it's hard to imagine that they are going to elevate it to a level that it needs to be at to kind of get over this hump, I think, simply by drafting guys. And so that then leads you to, who are you looking to trade for, or who are you looking to sign who's going to be a free agent? And so I think knowing that Ballard was seemingly brought back in part because of the way he changed gears, I have to think that we're going to see a big swing or two in some form outside of the draft, but certainly too early to tell exactly what that's going to be yet.
Yeah, I think we can tell where it's going to happen, though.
Yeah.
It's defensive end.
Mm-hmm.
Ballard said, we need to get younger and faster on defense. You can kind of break that down pretty quickly. If defensive tackle, I don't know, is this position that you feel like you have to get faster at. I also think the defensive tackles played pretty well, so I'm guessing that's not really what he was talking about. The secondary, you can make a case that they could get faster there, but also Sauce Gardner's back. Cam Bynum had a great season. Cam Bynum had a really, really good season. I think probably the best season on the defense by maybe a wide margin. So that's a corner. That's a safety. You could maybe get faster at slot corner if you decide to move on from Kenny Moore. Younger Nick Cross is not that young. I think that you could definitely move on from him if his price gets too much. But generally, I don't think of the secondary as a place where younger, faster is likely, especially given Lou Anarumo's proclivity for just not playing veterans in those spots. That leaves two spots. It leaves linebacker, where they had two older guys who don't run very well, and defensive end, where they were awful. They were awful at defensive end. I think they have two young guys that I would expect back, and then there's three veterans in Ebicom, Tyquan Lewis, and Kwity Paye that I just don't expect to see back. And so that's the spot. I think that's the spot. Whatever the move is, whatever. I kind of think they need to be a couple of moves at that spot. But that to me was one of the other takeaways is we need to get younger and faster on defense. To me, that's defensive end and linebacker more than anything.
Agreed. I think you need to have someone who is a game changer on that defensive end place. I know Shane and Chris and even Lou, I think over the last times that we spoke to them before the offseason really got into high gear, have all said that they really believe that Latu can and is going to develop into that type of game-changing guy, and that's great if that happens, but I just don't know if you can go into another season positioning him as the focal point of your edge rush and expect to get something much better than what we've got. I think it was Lou, the last time we spoke to him going into the last game of the year against the Texans, he was asked about Latu's performance in his second year and in his development process at large. And he was of the mind that the third year is where you really see guys blossom. And I know I wasn't around the beat, but I know you've written a lot about this topic. It seems like I read a decent amount about how year two was going to be the year where we really saw him blossom. And yes, he did get 8.5 sacks. That's not a number that you can completely ignore, but I think there are some circumstances around some of those late season sacks that, when you actually look at the plays and how they came, when you're blocking a running back or blocking a tight end or having kind of a coverage sack that was a lot because the secondaries did such a great job locking things down. Like it's not the frequency and the explosiveness and the type of energy behind those sacks that you are looking for as a guy who can truly spearhead your defensive attack. And so I feel, if they could get someone where he could be the second best guy, I think that really changes what you are capable of doing, and all of a sudden makes it a lot more difficult to defend you if you do have your two guys back at defensive tackle. at full strength who are experienced, and then have Latu and another game changer, whether that's a Jalen Phillips or a bunch of other names floating around there. He's one of the guys that comes to mind. But that seems like somewhere where they need to take another big swing.
Yeah, the talk on Latu, like you hit the nail right in the head. Last year they spent a lot of time in the offseason saying Latu's going to be a 10-sack guy. He's going to elevate the pass rush. He didn't. And I know they mentioned a lot of near misses. Frankly, I thought to me, that's the biggest issue is there's not enough near misses. His pressure numbers look good. If you look at NFL's next gen stats, he was in the top 20 in pressure numbers, but they're late pressures. They're late in the down. They're not early. They're not forcing him to. They're not the kind that force the quarterback up into the arms of somebody else. I think to me that's the biggest issue is there should be more almosts for me to feel better, because almost sacks that happen quickly, those things are the kind of things that like wreck plays. Like if you watch, and this is unfair to Latu because I'm going to compare him to one of the 3 or 4 best pass rushers in the league. If you watch Parsons, like, yes, there's usually 2 sacks in a game or 1 sack in a game, but there's also a ton of plays where he is just wrecking everything and the quarterback has to either get rid of it or scramble or something. The Colts don't move anybody off the spot, and that should be Latu. It's the same thing with, Myles Garrett, like those big time, those what I've called on the podcast before, those war daddy edge rushers. Those guys are the kind of guys who are constantly having almosts. And that's how you get to 15, 16 sacks is you have lots and lots of almosts. And if you put enough of them together, you're going to eventually get home. And that's how you get to the 12, 14 sack season that they need. I don't think we've seen that from Latu yet. Can it happen in the third year? Yes, it can happen in the third year. I don't think it's as when Lou Anarumo talked to us, he was like, that's the year for our pass rushers. I really don't think if you look at a lot of pass rushers that bears itself out. There's a few guys like that, but there's a lot more guys who are just good right away. If you look at the top edge rushers in the league, there's a lot of guys who are just really good right away and they just stay good. So yeah, they need to overhaul that position. And I just have questions there. I don't know if I buy the idea that we're just going to see a huge. It's a very large step. The last step that they need Latu to make from being a capable speed rusher who can help you to what they really need, which is somebody who drives the pass rush and creates opportunities for other people and wins even when everyone is and I shouldn't say wins, I should say just earns slide protection from the opposing team. That's a big step. That's the last step, and it's a really, really big step. And some guys make it, but a lot more of them don't. And so I have significant concerns with that position.
Yeah, I mean the difference between getting 8.5 sacks and some of them late in the year being a little, again, they happened, but there were some circumstances behind them. Whereas if he'd been blocked normal or if the secondary hadn't done their job, he could have like very easily been at like 5.5 or 6. I think the difference between being that type of guy and a guy who maybe racks up 14 while also requiring enough double team coverage to where someone else can get home or driving the quarterback forward into Grover Stewart or DeForest Buckner's arms. Like it's a very different type of dynamic player than what we saw. Again, as you said, it's possible, but it would seem like that would be a lot to bet on. It also seems like a little bit of a long shot that type of guy is going to come to you in your back half of the second round as they sit from a draft perspective, because they don't have their first round pick because they dealt it in the Sauce Gardner trade. So that just leads me even more so to think that they are going to have to be in the free agency market for some of those big money free agent guys, because they just can't afford to wait another year. If Daniel Jones is not going to be 100%, then you have to get notably better in other areas so that he doesn't have to be a MVP, dark horse MVP type candidate that he was. That I think you could have made the argument for through 8 or 9 or 10 games this season. I think it's a lot to bet on him being that, and I think it's almost as much, if not more, to bet on Latu taking that leap. And so you're going to have to go and take a run at someone. I think what that maybe brings us to, maybe it's a good segue. If you are going to make a big push for someone in the free agency market, you're probably going to have to, and you're giving more money to Daniel Jones, and you're re-signing Alec Pierce. Like, they're going to have to free up some cap space in some other ways. There's certainly some other guys that you can just forego and not re-sign. You can hope to draft some starters in the second and third round that could be pretty cheap to fill some slots, but there are probably going to have to be some guys that they part ways with even before they become free agents. Who would you say is your most likely Colts veteran who could be cut even before they have reached the final year of their contract as we look to this offseason?
I think it's Zaire Franklin. Just they need to get faster at linebacker. He's not very fast. I think his impact is less than, they've already said younger, faster on defense. Like I said, I think linebacker is the spot that jumps out at me. That to me feels like the spot. It feels like he's probably the most likely. I'm rolling through the other options in my head, and I can make a better case for them than I can for Franklin.
So, looking at his deal on over the cap, a pre-June first cut of him saves you nearly $6 million on cap. That's not nothing. There's also, I think, even some more guys. The biggest ticket guy that comes to mind, and I think this would be a really big roll of the dice, and something that I think would surprise me even more. What level of surprise would you have? Knowing that this is maybe another guy that could be potentially on the chopping block, someone who frankly even mentioned it himself coming after the Houston game in the locker room. Michael Pittman, I know he floated the idea that he knows he very well might not be back because he knows that there are going to have to be some drastic changes for this team to get to where it wants to be. Where would you rank this team parting ways with Michael Pittman in the realm of possibility as possible offseason moves that we could see over the coming couple months?
I think it's pretty high. I mean, I know a lot of people look at the Alec Pierce situation and just go, imagine what he could do on the open market. And I guarantee his agents are thinking the same thing. But I just don't know what this offense is without Alec Pierce replacing that guy. Like, we're not talking about just getting another deep threat. Mm-hmm. Like, you're talking about a guy who, as I've said on here before, everyone has known since the moment he entered the NFL that he's the guy that the Colts want to get deep, and he still does it 2 or 3 times a game. Like, beats everybody. Now, is some of that Shane Steichen? Yes, probably, but also there's so many deep threats across the NFL who have the reputation for being able to do what Alec Pierce does and don't actually do it. Like, they don't put up 1,000-yard season on 47 catches. It's much more hit or miss. His skill set to me is so valuable in a league where every defense now is geared towards taking away the big play. Having a guy who can just do it over and over and over again is so valuable to the offense. I think he's their best receiver. I think you have to find a way to keep him. Now, if I was Buffalo, would I want Alec Pierce? Yeah, I'd throw a crap ton of money at Alec Pierce if I was Buffalo. If I was Kansas City, I'd throw a crap ton of money at Alec Pierce. I'm sure there's a bunch of teams I'm not thinking of that would throw a bunch of money at Alec Pierce. But the Colts should want him. Alec Pierce himself said that if they sign Daniel Jones, which sounds like it's going to happen, it'll go a long way towards getting him back. if you're going to do that and you're going to pay Pierce what I think Pierce is going to be worth on the open market, which is north of $20 million, maybe by $5 million.
Yeah, I think 25 is very possible.
You might decide you don't want to pay. You don't want to have. You can structure it. Here's the other thing with the Colts salary cap space that I think maybe people haven't talked about enough. Because they have so many expiring contracts in 2026, you can schedule a lot of these deals so that they don't cost as much on the front end, and then they extend out past that. Because some of those deals, yes, you might want to re-sign the player. Like, I think there'd be an interesting, if they make the playoffs and it's not a different GM, I think there's an interesting decision to make on Jonathan Taylor. The defensive tackles, on the other hand, I think there's a chance that DeForest Buckner's not back. I think there's a chance that it's last year for Grover Stewart. Probably a good chance for both of those guys that those are the last years. Because of that, you could sign people to deals that have cap-friendly terms in the first year and spread it out the back end, because those long-term contracts are coming off the books. And I think maybe the need to clear a ton of cap space is a little bit overblown because of that. At the same time, Pittman's $29 million against cap this year. That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And
yep.
Pierce,
and
however you structure Pierce's deal, he's going to be a lot against cap. Do they really want to do that? I would say most of what I know of Chris Ballard and what he said about wide receiver in the past, I'd say no.
Yeah, $24 million in cap savings. Think of what you could do with that $24 million if you were to cut Michael Pittman. I mean, you're talking about a guy like Alec Pierce, who, this year his cap number was just a tad over $4 million. So automatically, again, I know they can do some fancy things to where how they structure these deals, but just from talking an average value, like, you're going to have to free up a good amount of money to be able to secure him again, and to re-up with Daniel Jones, who I have to think, even with with the injury, is going to have a deal that's still probably larger than the 1 year one that he signed this year, because of what we saw over those first 10 weeks. So the idea of being able to free up more than $20 million to just even get those two guys that you want to re-sign, not even thinking about who you want to go and make a run at from an edge rusher perspective. It's just hard to look at that big number of what they could save for Michael Pittman, and the idea that you could go and maybe draft a guy in the third round to try and fill that spot, knowing that you have Tyler Warren, assuming that you, of course, are going to re-sign Alec Pierce, and you also have Josh Downs. It's like they have so many reliable pass catchers right now anyways, in those three alone, that if you made the tough decision to part ways with Pittman and drafted someone that just, you need them to be a, reliable third-ish option. That seems definitely possible. And with my somewhat IU slanted bias, it's hard not to think about Surratt or Omar Cooper, who might be floating around there in that late second, early third round type slots, as someone who they could go and look at. Again, I have not dove deep into the draft prep yet, but those are guys who are just fresh on the mind, and someone who I'm sure a lot of Colts fans would love to see in blue and white jerseys next year.
We have not had this much in Colts land, where the pressure to draft players from the local school. I mean, Notre Dame is close, obviously, but I don't know that we've had the pressure of IU and a Colts thing really ever. This is something that a lot of teams deal with, and that's upcoming. So that'll be an interesting piece of draft talk. Is, do they just let Kenny Moore go and go get D'Angelo Pons? All that stuff. Generally, the way teams operate, they don't try to get locals or players. I should say players from the local colleges. But it does make for an interesting debate going forward. I think Pittman's in there, and then like I said, with some of these other guys, like take Kenny Moore for example. If Charvarius Ward retires, You have Justin Wally coming back off the ACL. That one, I think you can feel good about him playing at the start of training camp, just because ACL recoveries have gotten better over the last 10 years. And I don't know what you're going to get from him. There's no way to know. He's a rookie. Like, we only saw him for camp last year. But if Ward retires, then you have lost an outside corner. And, maybe you don't feel as good about if you're going to have Wally compete with somebody, or you bring somebody in, maybe you don't feel as good about that outside corner. Maybe you want to keep Kenny Moore at your nickel to play the role that Anarumo wants him to play. His coverage numbers weren't as bad as people make them out to be this season, according to Next Gen Stats. And now on the flip side, if Ward returns, which I don't think most of us think are likely, but it could happen, then maybe Moore becomes more expendable. Grover Stewart's an interesting one, because the one thing the defense did really well this year was stop the run. And you take him out of there, it's going to be a lot harder. Mm-hmm. There's also savings there. There's this give and take with some of these other ones. That's why Franklin and Pittman, I think, maybe seem like the more obvious ones. Pittman pre-back injury was a more reliable possession receiver than he's been the last couple of years. I think he said that. He said that in Houston, that he hasn't really lived up to the standard he set for himself early in his career. And I think that makes that spot a little bit easier to replace in the offense. Plus, just frankly, the presence of Tyler Warren, and you get a second year with him. That's a target player in the offense in that shorter range.
Yeah, there are constraints in the salary cap, and when you look at average annual value, there's about 15 guys at that $25 million mark and above. Pittman's kind of right around there, and it's just really just out of it. His average of his deal, $23.3 million. So if you're thinking that Pierce is going to rise above that, right around that $25 million mark, and you're just imagining what this team needs and how quickly it needs it, how urgent that is. It's hard to imagine when you think of what else you have. It's not like they don't have a guy at tight end who can be reliable to catch balls. Josh Downs has proven himself. It's just kind of hard to imagine this team needing to have two $23+ million receivers when you think of what the holes are elsewhere. So we'll see how that pans out. But those two, as you mentioned, I think are somewhat likely targets that could part ways. And those are big veteran names that have been with this organization for a long time. That won't be easy news for this team and the fan base. Zaire has been with the team since 2018, and Pittman was drafted in 2020 in that great draft class with Jonathan Taylor, both second round picks. Like those will not be easy decisions for Chris Ballard or for Carly Irsay-Gordon to make. Those, it's not like those guys aren't those guys are kind of woven into the framework of kind of this team's offense and defense's soul, but those are the types of moves that you have to make when trying to get over this hump and trying to go from being a team that's right around 500 every year to be able to get to being consistently in the playoff picture. You look at some of the teams that are still around and what they what a lot of them have are rosters who are fairly young at lots of spots. I was looking earlier today, working on a story, hopefully for Friday on Indy Star, just about, what some of the traits are from these four teams remaining in the conference championship games this weekend. And Seattle has a team that I think 10 of its 12 starters on offense, when you can include the fullback, you got 10 guys that are on their first contracts. That means that they are cheap in lots of spots because they are spending money in other places, and they are also drafting really, really well, because you can't be a competitive roster that has 10 guys out of 12 on your offense on first-year contracts and be competitive unless your draft is really, really solid. And it also means you're doing that and you're relying on youth because you are spending money in other places. And so I think that's not to say that this Colts roster is old by any stretch of the imagination. You still got, I think, probably half or so, if I were to guess off the top of my head, probably half of your offense is still pretty young. That offensive line, extremely so. 3 of your 5 starters on first contracts, along with Josh Downs and Tyler Warren. But it's they're going to have to really hit in this draft and also really hit in this free agency, because I don't think you can afford, these holes that we're talking about. I don't know that you can really afford to go through this off season and not see notable change really anywhere. And that goes with also kind of rolling the dice and hoping that Daniel Jones is what they hope he can be, because if he kind of falls through next year, I just don't know, despite what we saw and some of the strengths that we saw in him in that last game that Riley Leonard played, I just don't know that he's a guy that can come through and lead this team to the postseason and a big run of games against a tougher schedule. So this is a team that's going to have to rely on Daniel Jones and have to rely on hitting, not necessarily home runs, but hitting a lot of consistent doubles with the decisions that they make this offseason, and those decisions will be coming pretty quickly.
My only other thing I have for this pod is just a real quick one. The NFL, and this is probably true over all sports, but I cover the NFL and you cover the NFL, so that's what we're talking about. The NFL really loves to fire coaches before general managers. Colts fans know this better than anybody, because in 2022 they absolutely bottomed out and stuck with Chris Ballard without, in a year where most of us expected him to be done too. I think he probably should have been done at that time, but like it just sticks out. Like we were talking before we started actually podcasting, there's 2 GM openings and 10 coaching openings, and like Buffalo, this is me from the outside, obviously I don't cover Buffalo, but like, gosh, it feels like that roster is the problem in Buffalo. And not only did Brandon Beane get to stay, he got a promotion. Like, it's just wild that the GM, for whatever reason, usually gets more leeway than the coach. I'm sure there's some of that is that the coach is the one who has to answer all the questions in the media, and so he becomes the focal point. Some of that is probably proximity to the owner, just in terms of, what the general manager's role is versus what the head coach's role is. There's probably a lot of different factors that go into it, but it feels like a not market inefficiency. What's the word I'm looking for here? It feels like a flaw in the way teams are run.
The scale
longer leash.
The scale feels off. You're totally right on that. I did a story in the last week of the regular season looking at NFL GMs who'd been in their position for at least 9 years since the turn of the century, and what their resumes were in those first 9 years is how I did it. And Chris Ballard was among the worst in having a record sub 500, no division titles, 2 playoff appearances, a 1-2 record in the playoffs. But it was surprising to me that there were people who had lasted as long as him, if not longer, doing worse from a record standpoint. I mean, you look at, so I've got the list up in front of me right now. Guys that folks might know right now, Jason Licht with the Buccaneers, who's been there since 2014. Tom Telesco with the Chargers, lasted 11 seasons there. His record was, in his first 9 seasons, 69 and 76. Also no division titles, also only 2 playoff appearances. Like as much as we make of what Chris Ballard's record was, there were 5 GMs that had worse records that lasted at least 9 years. Like, this is, for whatever reason, GMs get a lot more runway in this league and are, as those numbers would probably suggest, oftentimes, depending on the owner, given, 2 or 3 head coaches worth stints to try and turn things around. And teams are pulling the plug on head coaches, as we see when you have 10 head coaching openings this cycle. Teams are pulling the plug a lot quicker. I mean, there's so many guys in the NFL that are not even getting the 3 seasons that Shane Steichen has gotten, that are getting fired, 2.5 years into, or, just after 2 full seasons. It's not even completely out of the realm that someone wouldn't get fired after a single season. I mean, we saw that this offseason with Pete Carroll in Las Vegas. I mean, there are head coaches, you are expected, if you are a head coach that's brought in, to bring a team to the playoff, assuming you're filling in for someone that you're assuming probably got fired. And probably, although, as we saw with Sean McDermott, not always the case, you're likely filling in for someone who did not make the playoffs either the previous season or maybe even a couple seasons in a row. And coaches are just not given a whole lot of time to turn things around. And it's not, NFL teams, when you have 53 players on active rosters, when you see how important the quarterback is and how few true difference makers there are at that position, it's not an easy thing to turn around a franchise in 2 or even 3 years. And I think we would certainly say that this team is no doubt in a better position than it was when Shane Steichen was hired at early 2023, 3 years ago now. And I think when you say that, when you would also probably argue that they really missed on on the quarterback that they drafted 4th overall, and Anthony Richardson, who after 3 years just hasn't really felt like he's panned out. I know it's someone that we haven't talked about, but I think it's probably someone that we would expect to get traded in some form this offseason. The fact that they are better in lots of places after 3 years is probably why Shane is still around, even though they haven't made the playoffs. But that's it's a really rare position he is in a head coach entering year 4 who's not made the playoffs. And again, in a similar story that I did compared to Chris Ballard, there are not many head coaches who go 3 years without making the playoffs that even make it all the way through year 4 without getting fired. I think that's something we need to be on the lookout for if this team were to start really slow. He and Chris Ballard, frankly, are going to be on the hot seat. We saw the Dolphins move on from Chris Greer, a similarly long tenured general manager who was fired in the middle of this season. If the Colts were to just, really struggle out of the gates, kind of like the Dolphins did earlier this year, I don't know that it's out of the realm of the possibility that we would not see one of the two of them let go if this just really flames out. So we'll be on the lookout for that once we get into the meat of the 2026 season, but still a long way to go from there.
That's all I got.
Yeah.
It's a very quiet January in Colts land.
It's exactly what we were asking for when we were right around that last week of the season. And selfishly, as a reporter, you're not rooting for a team or against a team. You're rooting for storylines, but you're also in some ways rooting for
yourself. It's okay to admit.
Yeah.
Sometimes we root for ourselves.
Yeah, we know. Hey, if you're not going to be in the postseason, as fun as it is to cover a team who's in the playoffs, who is, even if you're a 7 seed, you've got an outside shot at competing to appear in a Super Bowl, and it's a cool thing to have an opportunity to do as a reporter. But if you know that you're definitely not making it there, you're really just hoping that you're not covering a coaching search or a general manager search, or like someone on the Falcons beat doing both of those in the same offseason.
They also had a president search.
That's true.
The triple.
Yeah, they had a position that was added to the framework of that leadership, and then which of course seemed like it was a fairly obvious hire from the start in Matt Ryan. But yeah, not a quiet offseason for folks in Atlanta covering that team. Not a quiet offseason for a lot of folks that didn't have teams in the playoffs, and even some who were just covering 2 rounds of a playoff push, as we saw for reporters who are covering the Buffalo Bills, who had a lot to write about over the last couple of days after that press conference. That had a lot more fireworks in it than the 2 press conferences that we covered, speaking to Carly and Chris Ballard a couple weeks ago. So good to break those things down here. I'm sure we'll have more editions of the Colts Cover-2 podcast coming to you guys here over the next couple months. Combine will be here in a month or so, and then not long after that,
2028.
That's right.
Because they can't move it. They've been trying, but they can't move it.
Nope. Indianapolis is a great city for something like this. As cold as it may be, you do not have to go outside to navigate the combine, and that's one of the great kind of hidden things about Indianapolis and the way
it really comes down. It really comes down to where IU Health is located.
Yeah,
they can't move it because they can't do all the medicals in the same amount of time because IU Health is so close. That's like the whole reason that the NFL, obviously, I think Colts fans know, or Indianapolis football fans know, they've tried to move it. The combine is about the medicals more than anything, and they can't. There's no other place where they can just walk them in and walk them out the same way. That's like the logistics are just. Jeff Foster, who runs the combine, told me several years ago that if they move the combine, they'd have to make it 2 weeks, and that does not work with the NFL schedule. So
no.
That's why. That's why after all of the talk about Dallas and Los Angeles and all that stuff, that's why it's still here, because they can't. No one else has a hospital built close enough.
And when it comes down to it, Indianapolis is still pretty. When you're talking about people in private planes, like, it's not that big of a deal. But there's got to be something to the idea that it is in the somewhat middle of the country. It's not like everyone's driving here. So it's not as big of a deal. But I think the centrality to it has to matter at least a tiny bit. Although we've seen the Big Ten go and schedule media days, and it's Big Ten tournament for places like Vegas and Los Angeles here coming down the road, which is wild to even talk about, let alone plan to watch here in the coming years. But great thing to still have that here from an access and an ease of travel standpoint for us here in Indianapolis, and we'll have some more coverage about that, and that, of course, will quickly lead into some of the topics that we were discussing here about free agency and who the Colts will be able to hold on to, who they won't, and how they are attacking some of these holes that we have mentioned that they still have here on this roster as they build and look toward 2026. Thanks again of those of you who continue to follow us in the off season. We will, our stories will continue to all be on indystar.com. Please subscribe and like and interact with our page on YouTube, where all these podcasts are located. You can watch our videos there. Of course, we'll all still be on your typical podcast platforms. I would encourage you to like and subscribe there as well, and interact. Send us questions, comments there. We still try to look at those, and we'll also try to be on email or social media. If you have a specific topic you want us to dive into more, we can have a little bit more time to do that here in the off season. I know for those of you who are watching, Joel has a special guest to make an appearance here before we cap things off on today's podcast.
Watley, say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.